Stacey Cochran's one of the lucky people who knew at an early age what he wanted to do, and once he started writing, he hasn't looked back. He has an undergraduate and master's degree in English from East Carolina University and currently teaches part-time at North Carolina State University, teaches writing. And for the last couple of years, he's had an author interview show on WRTN, which is RTN Channel 10 television. Stacey's published 6 novels, and the newest is Claus, which he'll tell us about this evening, although it sounds like a lot of the people I've talked to have already finished it. Please help me welcome Stacey Cochran.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I think we're going to have a great event. I had this kind of divided into 2 different sections. First, I'd like to focus a little bit on the new book, Claus, since it's out. And then the second part of what I'd like to do tonight is get into a discussion of book marketing and literary agents, sort of, you know, the good stuff to make this worth your while. But to begin with, what I'd like to do is start by giving stuff away, because I found that if you do that, you know, it kind of warms up everybody a little bit. So I've got some of these handy little Colorado sequence magnets. This is from my last novel. Of course, tonight we're pushing the Claus book a little bit, and so I've got some of those to give away in a minute. In addition to that, I want to make this deal to anybody. If you buy, and this is a one-day only deal, if you buy 4 copies of Claus tonight, I will interview you about your book or your writing on my TV show. So if you buy 4 copies of Claus tonight, we can do a little bit of publicity for your book if you've got a book coming out sometime soon. And that'll go up on RTN, which is seen by some 80,000 homes here in Wake County, as well as on YouTube for a permanent basis. So think about that. But like I said, to get started with, what I'd like to do is begin with a couple of trivia questions. First off, who knows the name? This is kind of a tough one, particularly if you haven't read the book. But who knows the name of the protagonist in my last novel, The Colorado Sequence? I figured that would be the answer, so I had an easy second question lined up. Who can tell me which U.S. state is the primary setting in The Colorado Sequence?
I actually forgot the name, sorry, but I know what state. I read the book.
And then finally, a third question here, and let's do this by show of hands, because I figure a few people will know this one. What is the name of the self-publisher based previously in Morrisville with whom I published my first few books? Right here.
I'll put this with the other one on my refrigerator.
It's a charming little fridge magnet. So let me do a little bit of a reading from Claus. What I would like to read is just a brief couple of sections to give you a sense of the book, and I'm not going to get into stuff that's too intense. It is a pretty intense thriller novel. How many folks have actually read some of the books so far? Wow, almost half of us. That's great. Well, the section that I'm going to read here is from Chapter 2, the first part of Chapter 2, and then the first part of Chapter 3. Johnny Watkins was a homeless drunk who had seen more of the United States than most RV owners. He was 43, weighed 130, and carried all of his earthly possessions in a dirty green hiking backpack. His face was covered with soot and dirt, and he wore a beard that stretched down to his dirt-stained T-shirt. He had electric, sky-blue eyes, and he talked out loud to himself when in public. It was like whistling in the dark for a man whom no one in this world cared. He says moments like these when Dr. Angie Ripard knew she loved teaching. So it's a little bit of Claus. I'd love to take any questions if you have any about Claus. Like I said, I do want to shift towards actually doing kind of a marketing discussion, so if you have questions about literary agents or stuff like that. Do you have a question? Go ahead, Alice.
What was the inspiration for Claus? And I knew you had taught in Tempe.
That's right.
Right, so I was wondering how how it all came about.
It's a great question. I moved to Arizona from Raleigh. I actually grew up in Raleigh, so I'm from here. But I moved to Arizona in 2001 after graduating. And I had just finished the Colorado sequence. And right around that same time, or I should back up a little bit, while I was writing the Colorado sequence, a wildfire burned 250,000 acres of land in this area just north of Tucson. And what happened was it kind of drove cougars from areas where their normal prey, like rabbits and squirrels and that kind of thing, would normally live. And stories began appearing in the local Tucson newspapers and on local news that there were sightings of mountain lions. Several elementary schools actually had to be closed when there were sightings of mountain lions stalking, kids walking to school. And it became this really contentious issue in Arizona because, as you can imagine, it's kind of a polarizing issue. On one hand, you've got conservation. Conservation is saying, well, let's just relocate the animals. On the other hand, you have, other folks who aren't as, compassionate with other ideas about what to do. So it came from that, and I said, this is perfect material for a suspense novel. I fell in love with Arizona, if you've ever been there. And how many folks have been to Arizona? Just about everybody. You know the landscape then. It's definitely a place that inspires people to write. So that was really it, I think. In the back, yes.
Who's narrating and how did you make the decision?
Narrating the audiobook.
When you're reading? No, when you're actually reading, who are we listening to? Who's telling the story? Who's telling the story?
Who's the protagonist of the novel?
No. What's the point of view? Point of view.
Oh, well, the point of view, the protagonist is Angie Rippard, this wildlife biologist. She really carries the story. And she's, to me, I really loved her as a character because she's kind of conflicted. Her background, she had her first mountain lion encounter at a very young age in Tucson, and so has lived with these animals her whole entire life. And she's, conservation, friendly. That's her position in the novel. As the book progresses, there's a real estate developer, though, who, and I know you're in real estate, so maybe I shouldn't have said this, but. And if you ever, you've been to Arizona, you've seen these developments that are bordering national forest land and things like that. So I said, well, let's set up that duality. It's very much sort of Jaws inspired, clearly, but it's Angie's story, I think. Brenda.
I was very impressed with your research. Do you do your research on the internet, or do you really? Explain more about that, because you really give the details.
Well, this story actually dates back to when I was writing it. I had a dial-up internet connection in little old Oracle, Arizona, and so doing a lot of internet research was difficult. I do have very vivid memories, though, of going to the library and checking out a lot of books on mountain lions and on big cats of North America. So there was kind of a combination of doing research with books, reading articles by published wildlife biologists to kind of get inside the mindset of somebody and to kind of get a sense of what stances do they actually take. Are they really, pro-conservation? Do they try to remain neutral like a scientist should? Or do they have some other angle? So there was that kind of research, involved early on. But the book, it really only took about 6 months to write the first draft. This was one of those books that once I saw the subject matter and I knew kind of the concept of the book, I wrote it in a relatively short period of time. I probably did about 3 months of research before it really got underway, though. Yes, Nancy.
There's a few points in the book that are left unanswered. So, and I'm not going to spoil it for those that haven't read it. Are those addressed in Clause 2, and how far along?
Well, not knowing. There is a second book. There actually is a second book. It says at the back of the book, Clause 2 in 2010. Well, Clause 2 is done. In fact, I broke it out last night for the first time. I hadn't read it in 3 years. These are books. Typically, my timeline for writing a book is like 6 months to a year. And then, back when I was first writing this, I was shopping it around, trying to get agents. And so a lot of time went past before I finally decided to publish this book on my own. But Clause 2, interestingly enough, I don't want to give too much away there since we are on the Clause book, but Claus 2 takes off in Colorado with the idea of whether grizzly bears actually live in Colorado, and whether they're still there, whether there's any population left. And the idea that I had there was, if you've got a population that's really endangered in an area, what happens if you have confrontations, with humans? Much like you've seen and read about the wolves when they've been reintroduced, it's a very controversial issue, particularly in more populated states like Colorado and Arizona and states like that. So I hope some of the threads are kind of tied up. There certainly is a romantic element to Claus 2 as well as the first book. So very good. Thank you for the question. Yes?
What's the difference between a cougar and a mountain lion?
It's the same thing.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, they go by the same name, and sometimes
Is it regional?
sometimes you hear the word puma as well. It's basically the same species, Felis concolor, of mammal. But now I should say that on the East Coast, particularly in Florida and even in North Carolina, where there are presumed to be some, not many, like less than 50, that's how endangered they are on the East Coast, it's a different subspecies. It's the eastern cougar, and it's actually isolated from, geographically, from western cougars. And so those are much more highly endangered. In fact, they're critically endangered in Florida.
And so what's with the mountain lion cougar? What's the, is it regional?
That's a good question. I don't know. You often see, the two used interchangeably, I think. Yeah. And wildcat as well. Rob?
Yeah, another question for you. Just curious about how your process works.
Mm-hmm.
So you heard the story, and did it occur to you right in the moment that you wanted to write a book about this, or did you just hear the story and then some months later you woke up out of a sound sleep, or you were breaking the yard or something, and it just hit you that you wanted to write?
I think it happened right around the same time. I wrote the first 3 chapters of this book, the 2 that I actually read, 2 of which I actually read tonight, in a matter of about 2 days, the first drafts of which came right on the heels of the Colorado sequence. And I think I had maybe been seeing some of these stories in the news, but it's kind of hard to pinpoint whether, I didn't really get focused on discovering this until actually I sat down and said, well, can I even write a first few chapters for this? And then at that point, I really began, doing the research in depth, checking out books from the library. Had a stack of books at the house at one point. So it was right around the same time. And I was living in an area about 30 minutes north of Tucson, which I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's up in the mountains. It's very remote. The little town that I lived in only had about 2,000 people in it. And I was doing a lot of cross-country running at the time. I was training for like half marathons and that kind of thing. And it didn't even occur to me in that first year that there was any wildlife that I needed to be aware of. So I was doing a lot of backcountry, jogging, and that's exactly the kind of behavior and naivety that leads to encounters a lot of times. And it occurred to me that I'm probably not the only person like that in Arizona, which is one of the most migrated 2 states. I mean, it has this huge population explosion, and so I said, there's something here for a novel. But to answer your question specifically, I think it was right around the same time, and I think I saw this topic and I said, okay, this can be my next novel, and I began doing the research, kind of fleshing out the book a little bit, and it all sort of coalesced in that 1 year. Yes.
Does it typically work that way for you?
No. This was an unusual novel for me. The first few books that I wrote, like the Colorado sequence and this book, and even Claus 2 to some degree, the Amber Page book, if you guys are familiar with that, I really cranked those novels out very quickly. And it was a very creative time of my life when I was writing a novel every 6 to 9 months in a lot of cases. Since getting back to North Carolina, being married, having a child, being gainfully employed again, and my pace has kind of slowed down a little bit, and I'm focusing more on character now. I wrote this book back in 2004, maybe 2005, and my pace now is to really kind of really take my time with a book, So there's an energy to this book. I started reading Claus 2 last night for the first time in like 3 years because I was thinking, well, I need to bring it out, at this point. And there's an energy to those books that's different, I think. So there's something to be said. It's kind of the Stephen King mentality of writing a novel, of just planting your butt in a chair and cranking out 2,000 words every day, no matter whether you think the book isn't going anywhere or not, and just getting it done and then seeing what you've got after 3 months or 6 months' time. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of discipline to do that. I don't know that I have that energy anymore, but it was fun to do these, definitely. Yes?
Actually, two questions. One is I wanted to know your approach to writing a book. Like, do you do an outline kind of thing and kind of get where you want the chapters to go, or do you just kind of write organically and see how it comes out?
That's a great question. With this book, the early few books, I wrote very organically. I could kind of see the end in sight. I knew a lot of times what the climax of the book would be, but getting there, I really didn't know, and I had to just write it out day after day. Sometimes I took wrong turns, had to delete stuff, go back and rewrite it. Now I'm not writing that same way. Now I'm doing everything very kind of deliberately. Like the book that's my work in progress right now, I have a compendium for it, an actual notebook with 5-page character sketches for all of the characters. It's a much more, I think, complex novel in a lot of ways. It's a Southern Gothic novel that I'm working on. And every time I get to a new chapter, I sit down, open up the compendium, and see, well, who is this character that I want to write on in this scene and in this chapter? What's their background? Have they had a divorce? Have they lost a child? Do they have a smoking problem, a drinking problem? What is their whole backstory, so that that's informed when I'm actually writing that chapter. I didn't do that for the early books. In addition to that, I'm using a chapter-by-chapter outline. Now, I've never heard of anybody doing this exactly. A lot of folks have like a full outline for a novel that they sit down and they flesh out, and it's maybe 10 pages long or what have you for the whole book. What I'm doing with my current work in progress is I set up an outline for each chapter. And probably most interesting to the writers in the room is I start with an emotional arc, and I say, where is the character at emotionally at the beginning of the book or at the beginning of this chapter? Are they in a state of anxiety? Are they depressed? Are they exhausted? Where are they at emotionally at the start of the scene? And then I ask myself, where do I want them to be emotionally by the end of the scene? So that's one thing I do. And then I write down in this outline as well what the character's internal goal is and what the character's external goal is. And then what is the obstacle to that external goal in that scene, and I write that down. And I do that for each chapter. So like, when I start the next chapter for this book that I'm working on right now in like a week or whatever, I'll sit down and I'll say, okay, who's the character that I want to focus on in this scene? Who's going to be the POV character, the point of view character in this scene? I'll look at this compendium, kind of get a sense of that. Maybe that takes 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll write an outline for that chapter, which might take 2 hours or so to, or an hour to 2 hours to kind of flesh out exactly what I want to do. And that might be all the writing that I do for that chapter that day. Then I wake up the next day or a couple of days later, once I've got that framework set up, and I can build from that, and then I write the scene. I hope that helps. These are great questions.
I have one other question. You told us how you got the name of the protagonist. The other character you mentioned was Johnny Rankins, I believe. How did you come up with that name?
That was my imagination. Just made that one up.
No one in this room.
No. There are a lot of winter homeless folks in Arizona, and you can't drive around Phoenix and not be confronted with it, and your heart, kind of goes out to these folks. I hope that scene kind of conveys a little bit of the compassion that I felt towards this guy. And I come from sort of the Steinbeck school, who, we love our dirt broke, working class folks anyway. So, yes.
Stacey, do you do all your own editing, or do you have someone else, other than readers, do you have somebody else, or do you have someone else edit it for you at any point along the way?
I do. I have a great writing group that I work with right now, sort of a small, intimate group, and we knock a manuscript around every few months. For Claus, I had outstanding writing group in Arizona who gave me some really extremely good feedback for this novel in its first draft. And I put the entire novel in front of them, took them out to eat, paid for their, their dinner, and for about 2 or 3 hours we just kind of knocked around this manuscript. Some of the things right off the top of my head that changed in this book, and I don't want to give too much away about the end of the book, but some of the things that happened at the end of the book they found were too harsh, and so I went back and rewrote it and tried to keep more in character with Andrew Rippard. That was one of the things that they mentioned. So yes, I always get feedback, from some good readers. Now that's changed slightly. The early books I would just put a full manuscript in front of my writing group, and everybody who's here should think about, if you're not already a part of like a small critique group, I think it makes you accountable and that kind of thing. But in the when I was writing these early books, I would put an entire manuscript in front of the group, and it was somewhat taxing, I'm sure, on them to read the whole book and then to get together. With the books that I'm working on now, the more recent, let's say, year or two, with my writing group there, I put a few chapters at a time in front of them. And so they're kind of helping me as I go along and give me an indication of whether I'm going down the wrong path, while I'm working on the book, which is really nice, because then I'm not, 100 pages into something that's not working, and I'm able to make revisions that way. Okay, yeah, Rob?
I hate to dominate, so if I'm doing that, tell me.
Last question.
So I fear critique, of course, more than anything else, just because I don't know how to process that information properly. And of course, any critique is based on personal viewpoint. So how do you sort through that and make a decision to redirect what you're doing based on a critique? Is it sort of like you look?
That's an excellent question. That's an outstanding question. I think we all know the feeling of sitting down and saying, this is my manuscript, and thinking it's really great, and then having people say, this is just ludicrous, I don't know. You develop thick skin, and hopefully you find a group of people who are, they have your best interest at heart, and so they're giving you feedback to improve the quality of your writing, and maybe even the quality of your own character. I think the two are really closely intertwined. And so if you go into it with an open mind and say, I'm not a perfect person, I can learn, and I want to learn, and I value the feedback that you guys can give me, then I think you're in a much better place.
And I guess I just mean, just to clarify that, I guess I just mean that I'm wondering how you decide how much of the advice you're going to take. Do you look for a common thread?
Sure. Another excellent question. I think ultimately the story is your own. You are most responsible for what you end up putting out. And so you have to make the judgment call. It's just like being a manager or something. You can take input from people around you, but ultimately it's your call. That said, once you've got a really good writing group, it's like a band. And we've all seen really good bands, and we've all seen, sort of middle bands, and we've seen bad bands. And if you've got a really good band of people together, they're going to be giving you feedback that most likely you want to use in some way, shape, or form. It's nice to have people who can give you kind of line edits on a book, as well as more character-based things, like how consistent is the character throughout. More conceptual things. The agent that I'm working with now, who I signed with, and I'll get to that in a minute, talking about how we met and everything, she is, without a doubt, the most brilliant concept editor I have ever worked with. And it's easy to see why she was president or vice president of ICM and William Morris earlier in her career, sold all the Tom Clancy novels to major motion pictures. She's just a genius. She can look at something in a scene and make one very sort of almost flippant comment that changes the entire texture of the scene if I, as a writer, am open to it, sit down, and then apply her feedback. So there are editors like that who can give you that kind of feedback as well. And I think having a healthy balance of all different kinds of editorial feedback is really key. One or two more questions, and I want to kind of move back into the marketing and stuff and transition a little bit.
Do you find that structural kind of criticism is, at first it might be difficult
to deal with, but because you can tell that it's not personal, or this didn't feel right to me, but they're able to give you very structural components. This doesn't work because blah, 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 or this would be stronger if you did this, and there's always that component to it. It makes it much easier to decide if you want to integrate it or not, as opposed to, well, you know, I don't think I'd really have a green wall, or this was kind of slow for me, but they can't really put their finger on
Sure.
why it's slow. And so that's, I think, when you say finding a great writing group, you have to have people who are good writers themselves to help guide you along.
Leslie, you're absolutely right. You know, and I think having a good balance is key. One of the members in my writing group gives really good line edit, and she's a copy editor. That's what she does professionally, and so she's able to see, just like sort of maybe awkward phrasings or things like that, that hopefully as a writer you're picking up on that kind of thing. But she's really good at that, you know. And so different people have, you know, different strengths as readers. So I think that, you know, that's really key to have a good balance, I think. Let's take one more question, then I want to transition into the second part of this. Yes, ma'am.
I did have the experience of having, well, like a one-shot, you know, writers thing to do. You know, we have the weekly, you know, present your novel. And I did learn how it was more like just listening to what people had to say. And the majority of people, I mean, this is a question, but the majority of people felt one way. Like they didn't like something about the narrator, but they loved another character. And then I found that I was emotional about that, but I went home and I said, I rewrote the whole novel through the point of view of the character. And it made
I could kind of repeat that.
really work.
Paraphrase what she was saying.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and I can relate to it actually personally on a couple of different points. The point was, you know, sometimes when you get feedback, it's difficult to take, but if you live with it a little while, you'll come around to saying, well, if 9 out of 10 people are saying this, maybe there's something to it. You know.
Well, my question was, how did you find, where are those people? These are folks from all over the country due for that 1 week. And as a part-time writer and somebody who's been home with the kids, working out of my home, I don't have, maybe a lot of writers are not, or like this, I don't have access other than this is my first time coming to this, so this may be the beginning.
Well, you're totally in the right place. This is a lot of folks here are with the Raleigh Write to Publish group, and we're all aspiring writers. I mean, that's what we're all about. My writing group kind of formed, I think, a little bit from this. Certainly, yeah. You know, so just introduce yourself to folks afterwards, and say to people, you know, I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee sometime and talk about your work, and it can take off from there. But to your point, I've definitely had my skin thickened over the years quite a bit. And I think I've got a pretty healthy ego and self-esteem now to where I'm pretty open to most every kind of feedback. I don't know, maybe Elisa can speak to this a little bit more since she's in my writing group. But I don't try to defend myself, you know, when we're knocking a manuscript around, because I know that the folks in my group are giving me the feedback to make the work better. That said, the agent that I'm working with now, she has some really brilliant feedback early in the book, but there's this one point that I'm having to get my mind around about the end of the book, and this major change that she wants to make at the end of the book. For one thing, it's going to take a tremendous amount of work to kind of rewrite the end of the book, and then the second point is I'm not entirely sure I agree with her yet. The operative word is yet, because I might come around to saying, you know, she's been right on just about everything else she said in the novel. Maybe it's just I need, you know, a few weeks to really work on the end of the book and rewrite a whole different ending to the book. So, yeah, and a lot of times, you know, the parts that you think that you love the most are the hardest to let go, but sometimes they need to be let, you know, to let them go. It's tough. You know, we're all writers, and we're all in this. Yes, one more question, then I'll move forward.
How do you take feedback from your spouse?
And he's got the camera out.
And the wife right next to him.
Invited him.
It's tough. Susan, who is in the back corner here, she gave me feedback a lot on the early books. She was extraordinarily, instrumental in Claus. I think it's very much, the character of Andrea Rapport is very much inspired by some of the strengths that I see in her. And I think I was very hungry for feedback in those, with the early few novels. But I did learn that I needed to develop my own critique group and have my own group that was giving me feedback too, which is different than the kind of feedback that my wife gives me. I would say the feedback that you give me now is much more contentious and heated than the first couple of novels. It's so, and you'll hear like Alexandra Sokolov, if you come to her event later on this week, or if you've seen her, you know she doesn't give her partner her books, and he doesn't read them, which seems maybe a little bit, strange, I guess. But no, I try to give Susan the work, and we both have very busy, extraordinarily busy lives. But I think having your own critique group goes a long way towards keeping everybody sane at home. So that said, we're working on a textbook together now, which is actually, we sold this textbook together to Bedford St. Martin's, and that's an entirely intertwined collaboration together. When we knock out a chapter on that or hammering out exactly what we want to do with that, we get together, we have one other co-author, which is a nice, I think, balance as well, and he's excellent. And so we treat it very professionally, and we say, well, what do we need to do in this chapter? And then somebody's going to go back and write it, and then, so, I don't know, it's an interesting thing to be able to collaborate, and I wish you guys the very best at doing so. I do want to give some more stuff away for free, though, and I've got some animal-related trivia questions here. Got a few more of these magnets to hand out. The first question, and we'll do this by show of hands again, so I think a few people, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see if you guys know this one. What is the largest mammal? What is the largest mammal native to North America? Native to North America, not the Atlantic Ocean. No, a land animal, I should say. I heard somebody say it. Bison is actually the accurate answer, but I've got two here, so whoever said buffalo, I'll give you one as well. Who said buffalo? And the bison weighs upwards of 3,100 pounds, I found out. Okay, second question. We've got two more of these, and then I want to transition into the agent discussion and marketing discussion a little bit. Second question. What large carnivore is listed as an endangered species in Colorado, but is presumed to be entirely gone from the state? That's right. Yeah, if you were listening earlier. Which is a perfect place for me to say Claus 2 is coming out next year. It was really interesting because I didn't know whether there were actually grizzly bears in Colorado, and I said, well, let me do some research on that and see if there's a novel there. And it's presumed that the very last grizzly bear in Colorado was actually killed by a bow hunter in 1979. Ed Wiseman, it's well documented. In the San Juan Mountains in the southwest corner. If you've ever been to southwest Colorado, has anybody been to Durango, Telluride, that area? You know what a wilderness area that part of the state is. It's not like Denver. And so there's thousands of acres of land that are very much unadulterated at this point. And so that was where I kind of took the jumping off point was, well, what if grizzly bears, what if there's a remnant population isolated in those mountains? The last question, what animal has the longest lifespan on Earth?
Oh, the big sea turtle.
Sea turtles.
If I say enough, I might get it.
So what I'd like to do next to kind of bring us home here is talk a little bit about book marketing, some of the things I've done on this particular round with Claus. And to get us started with, how many folks are familiar with the blog tour I've been doing lately? most of you. Basically, what I decided to do, this is the first time I've ever done this. And if you've got your own book and are thinking about, well, how do you market your book? You don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars and a publisher behind you. What do you do to market your book? Well, with this, I've done a blog tour, and I set up what I'm calling a 45-day blog tour. And essentially, a blog tour is where I am visiting blogs in some sort of, or websites in some sort of official capacity, where I've contacted the proprietor of a blog in advance and said, you know, I'm doing a blog tour. Can I guest blog at your place and talk a little bit about publishing, or talk about writing, or talk about this book, or talk about whatever your audience would be interested in? And I set it up for 45 days. That's the time span. In those 45 days, I think I have about 25 blogs that I'm actually visiting. Now, I had never done anything as concentrated as this before with any of the earlier books. And it's been tremendous to see the momentum that has developed out of this. And I think more than anything, it makes me accountable to every couple of days I have to sit down and write out a new blog post. And that kind of energy has created a lot of momentum for the book. We've sold a lot of copies of the book. There's, you know, some of the reviews have already been put up on Amazon, and that's driving people to the book as well. And I think the idea of having it concentrated for like 45 days is really key. Maybe 30 days would be more comfortable for you, but I think having some kind of set time. The neat thing about this clearly is I'm not actually out doing a lot of driving, burning up fuel, spending hotel money, trying to find stores all over the Southeast, although I think you can do it in conjunction with that too. I don't think it has to be done in and of itself. And it's been really tremendous. I've seen a few people doing blog tours, but not a whole lot, and so it's a fairly new concept. And it's generated a lot of momentum. One thing that it's generated out of doing this is I've done 2 Skype interviews. How many folks here have actually used Skype? Wow, that's almost a third of us. Well, Skype is, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's a kind of it's a way of making a phone call essentially through your computer. And if you're on Skype, which is free, it's spelled S-K-Y-P-E. If you go to skype.com, you can sign up for a free account there. You can make phone calls to anybody who's on Skype around the world and talk through your computer. Like my laptop has a little microphone, an internal microphone in it. And what people are doing, what a few people are doing, is they have their own sort of little podcast shows, their own radio shows that they're doing out of their, out of their room, out of their homes. Some are a little bit more sophisticated than others, and some have larger audiences than others. Both of these Skype interviews that I've done came about as a result of being out on this blog tour and people finding out about what I was doing. And then they contacted me and said, would you be interested in doing an interview? So that's another marketing strategy that's totally brand new. I've never heard of people doing this kind of Skype interview show type thing more than about a year. I didn't even hear about it until this year, really. Maybe they've been around for a year or two. So if you've got a new book that you're thinking about promoting, you might do, an internet search for Skype podcast, interview book shows or something like that. Have I? I have, yeah. It was just about a week or 2 ago.
You're not using video. It's just audio? Where they used to do the...
I used it just about a week ago. And they do have video.
I video conference with my intern this morning. She's in Dallas. So, yeah, I'm a little surprised to hear just audio.
Yeah. Well, that's where I'm at. As with the TV show here in Raleigh, the author interview TV shows, when I did these and I actually downloaded, the Skype software and used it for the first time, I said, this is what I've been needing. Or this is something I can certainly use. It's a tool. A lot of the interviews that we do clearly are based here in Raleigh. And so we have to have an author here in town to actually interview them. But if I could interview somebody with a fairly high quality video and audio, a teleconference, and record it, and then use that segment on the TV show, and that person's in Seattle or Japan or wherever, that's a huge advantage. And it's free, which is really cool as well. So I've done a couple of those, the Skype interviews as well. Yes, sir.
Some of the computers also have webcams, and that what you're referring to also? You have
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see the person and see their movements and, you know, and talk about the whole thing with them. Is that
You can. Yeah, I have a.
But that's not my question.
Yeah.
My question has to do with the blog tour. How do you actually get, where do you find the blog tours? Or
How do you get hosts, in other words? I just asked folks, and I found them first because I visit and frequent a lot of blogs, probably about a half dozen to a dozen. Some of these blogs are, you know, local authors, like Elisa has her own blog, and she hosted me one day. And some of these are high-profile authors. I visited one site about a week ago that has like 8 Chicago-based authors, a couple of them New York Times best-selling authors. I'll be doing a guest blog in a couple of weeks at another one where there's like 6 best-selling authors. And I had met some of these authors that I'm asking. I had met them at writers' conferences and being part of that community. And so I just asked. A few of them have come about after actually doing some of these. People have contacted me and said, I've seen you doing this blog tour. I'm interested in, you know, I'd love to help you out, is basically what a few people have said.
Stacey, there are services of you know, who will organize the tour for you. I mean, obviously they're going to charge a fee for that, but that's also a resource that is available that they'll find, you know, they'll find the sites that match your book and
I had not heard that before. Yeah, so if you don't have a wide net of connections, then you can do something like that. It certainly sounds viable. I think, though, you can do a lot of this on your own. You know, if you just ask people, a lot of times they're willing to help you out, and then you're not paying anything. But that's neat to see that there's already a service for this. It's like travel agents. Somebody's already, you know, set up a business of, I can hook you up with, you know, blog interviews for $50. Yeah. One other thing, too, I want to pass around the sign-in sheet. You guys know I usually pass around the sign-in sheet so that I can let you know about upcoming events that we have going on with the Raleigh Right to Publish group. So let me get that started. There's a front and back to that. One other thing you guys have heard me mention a lot before, Podiobooks.com is an online audiobook publisher. If you are interested in doing an online audiobook version of your book, Podiobooks does put out books, and there's no cost to do that. There's not a whole lot of money generated from it either, though, because they don't charge for these audiobooks. You might look up Audible.com as well. Audible is a for-profit business, and if you can sell them your audiobooks online, then they can make the audiobooks for sale online, and I know a few people who have done that actually. So it's another way to reach an audience. Some people prefer to listen to a book, you know, on an MP3 player or on their computer or you know, what have you. So Podiobooks.com is one that I've used as well. That's Podio is Podio, Books. B as in Bob. As in books. Podiobooks.com. And there are a couple of agencies or companies kind of like Podiobooks, so just do a little bit of homework for online audiobooks and maybe self-publishing online audiobooks or something of that nature, and see what looks the easiest to use. Some of these you have to be a little bit more tech-savvy than others to do. I do want to pass around this agency query letter and talk a little bit about how I ended up signing with the agent about a month or two ago that I'm working with right now. So let me get these started around, and you guys can keep these. I have 40, so I'll pass one to each corner. Looks like we have a few more than 40 people, so if you can look on with somebody next to you, that might be a help so that they get filtered all the way around. Literary agents. How many folks know what I'm talking about when I say literary agents? Okay, about half of us, a little bit more than half maybe. Literary agents, very quickly, are the folks who represent authors in selling the author's book rights to major publishers. Most of the books in this store, particularly the ones on these racks back over here, which are the fast-moving books, are represented by a literary agent. They're a little bit like real estate agents. They sell, the rights for an author's work to publishers, and so they work on behalf of the publishers. It's a little bit like the trying to find the Holy Grail, to actually find the right literary agent for you. Most of us know it's pretty tough to find them. That said, they're in the business of finding new authors, and that's how they make a living. And if they're doing this full time, they want to find new clients. That's how they make a living. That's how they pay their mortgages. There's one website, if you're taking notes, agentquery.com. Agent Query is all one word, .com. It's a free website to use. And at Agent Query, you can type in the type of book you've got. So if you've written poetry, or you've written, a thriller, or you've written a memoir, you can actually list that in the search engine at agentquery.com and look up agents who actually represent that kind of work. And it'll show you their names, their mailing addresses, sometimes their email addresses and phone numbers. So check that out if you haven't. How many folks have actually used agentquery.com? Only a few people. It's a free web service, so you might check that out if you're at the point of wanting to find a literary agent. So earlier this year, this is an entirely other novel, a new novel that has not been published yet. I just finished it up last year, titled The Profiler's Wife. And it's a crime thriller set here in North Carolina with a UNC Chapel Hill professor of forensic psychology as a protagonist. And in January of this year, I decided to query agents with an email query. And so I sent out a batch of queries, maybe 10 at a time, every couple of weeks, and then saw what kind of response I was getting, and then made decisions based on the kind of feedback I was getting. And that's a little bit different. In the past, I had sent actual letters in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and mailed it to the agents. This year, I decided to email them. And what I'm finding is that most agents in 2009 are receptive to email queries, which saves you the price of the stamp, saves you some paper there a little bit. And you, again, can find the email addresses for most agents in the business at agentquery.com. So early this year, I started querying for this latest novel. I've got this new novel titled The Profiler's Wife. I think it could find a home at a major publisher. I definitely know it could find an audience in terms of readers. And so I needed to find a literary agent who would represent it to the major publishers. In the United States, we have about 6 major publishers, which are big corporate conglomerates. There's Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, Penguin Putnam, Random House, Grand Central, and that might be it. There's about 5 or 6 of them. And these folks generally will not look at a manuscript from an author unless they're represented by a literary agent. And so it really is in your best interest to get an agent if you're trying to sell a manuscript or a novel to the biggest publishers in the country. So this is the letter that I sent out. Let's take a look at the letter, and then we can kind of discuss it a little bit afterwards. When I put it in email, I didn't have a header, and I didn't have my telephone number and email address at the bottom because it was in an email. But I did put the date and then the agent's name, their location, and I personalized each one of these, which I think is really key. If you're writing a query to an agent, you want to try and personalize it to a specific agent. The first sentence says, I'm writing to introduce you to my novel, The Profiler's Wife, for which I'm seeking representation. I get right down to it right in the first sentence. I'm sending this letter to you, this email to you, because I'm looking for representation. The second paragraph describes the novel itself. It's kind of a synopsis. The second and third paragraphs. When forensic psychologist Roman Phoenix and his wife Gabby moved to the Carolinas, they are ready to rebuild their lives. 6 months earlier, they lost their 6-year-old daughter and Roman has accepted his first teaching job since graduating from Nebraska's forensic psychology law program. But fate has other plans for Roman and Gabby. FBI agents inform Roman and Gabby of a serial killer's twisted plans involving them. The killer, known as the Highwayman, begins contacting Roman because of his research area, which is road rage. And Roman's profiling skill is put to the test when the Highwayman abducts Gabby. So very quickly I had to whittle, a 75,000 word novel down to a couple of paragraphs describing the book. And that's really your hook. That's where you really grab an agent's attention. And some agents are not going to be interested in this kind of novel. Maybe they represent only romance, or maybe they represent only literary fiction. And so a mystery crime thriller like this might not appeal to them. And that's good to know, so you can get it out there and get it to the right agent. One of the things I think has changed in my thinking about agents in the past few years is realizing when you get to meet agents, how many folks here have actually chatted with an agent before? Maybe a couple of people. They're very real people, and they have their own quirks, and they're actual people. They're not just this sort of nebulous, society that won't let you in. But they're real people, and they have their own tastes and their own ambitions and motivations and hang-ups and flaws and all of that, just like all of us. And I don't think when I first started, I didn't really realize that. And I was like, well, any agent can sell a novel. That's not the case. You really want to find the right agent for you. And there may only be 5 that are really right for you. There may only be 1 that's really right for your book and your career as well. So you want to be thinking about that as you start. And when you get, rejections, which invariably happen, don't let it, it's kind of hard not to, but don't let it bother you, because that means that agent is not the right person for your book. And I'm serious, when you meet some of these agents, you don't want some of them representing your work. So you really are looking for the right one for you. The 4th paragraph here is bio information. Mine has really grown over the past few years. If you don't have a lot of publishing cred, draw on your strengths. Maybe you have a background in sales. Maybe you're a member of a vibrant writers group that you can count on to buy your books. Draw on your strengths there. But that's the section where you put some bio information. If you don't have a whole lot, then go with the synopsis of the book and sell them on the book, because an agent's going to buy a book if it's really, really good. They're going to want to represent the book, no matter whether you're a shoe salesman or whether you've published books before. If the book's good enough, if the story's good enough, it'll find its way to publication. I truly believe that. The last paragraph, or the last meaty paragraph there, I'd like to work with an agent. That really is where I kind of focus on the kind of agent that I have visualized in my mind, and I think I've actually found it in Irene Webb. She is very passionate. She has a ton of focus. She's extremely intelligent. She has tons of credentials, and I'm just thrilled to be with her. And quite honestly, I'm treating the whole thing like a learning experience. Even if she can't sell this novel or doesn't sell the novel, I know the book has gotten better just by having her giving me her feedback on it. And I'm learning the business that much more by having worked with her. And so that last paragraph was really where I kind of draw everything together. I typically close these query letters with, would you like to read the manuscript? So you'd let them know that the manuscript is ready to be read. I have heard a few stories, even recently. I'm trying to remember who it was that I heard recently. No, it was Lee Child. I actually interviewed Lee. How many folks came to the Lee Child thing earlier this week? New York Times bestselling author. His book just came out at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Interviewed him Tuesday, and his first novel, he queried an agent when he only had like the first 50 pages or 100 pages of the book, and he had handwritten it. He had done it in longhand, and he got an agent right off the bat who wanted to represent it and said, "Send me the rest of the manuscript." So he had to actually write the rest of the manuscript. I'm sorry?
Are most of the agents based in New York?
Most of them are, but that's I would say 98 to 99% of them are based in New York. Irene happens to be based in New Mexico. Her background is that she sold film rights for, this is my idea, she sold film rights for ICM, International Creative Management, and William Morris for a number of years. And so she has a West Coast connection. She has recently stepped out of working with International Creative Management and William Morris to open her own agency, which, you know, I'm just blessed to be there. But most of them are based in New York. Other questions? Yes?
What would you do differently if you were focusing on nonfiction?
What would I do differently? Depends on the kind of nonfiction. What kind of nonfiction are we talking? I think it sounds great. First, and cooking books do extraordinarily well, and so you're already a lot further ahead of a lot of folks by having that concept in mind. If you've got a website, it sounds like you do, and you've got a lot of traffic there, and if you have a personal business that's kind of connected to it in some way, you might draw on that. I think with nonfiction, you want to focus a little bit more on your personal credentials with the book, because you're talking presumably about something that you have an expertise on. It makes sense that you would want to talk about your background a little bit more than with fiction. You bet. Yes, Jurgen.
You're referring to manuscripts. What about if a book has been published in terms of getting a
If a book has been published with, say, a major publisher or self-published?
a small publisher in London?
Okay.
Or self-published.
Okay, well, there are two different things. If the book has already been published with a small publisher, and the publisher actually paid you money and bought the rights to the book, you're going to have a difficult time selling that to an agent, because what an agent sells basically are the rights to publish a book, and usually they sell the first copyrights for the book.
Well, the book, you know, it's copyrighted, but copyright has not been sold anywhere.
Chances are if you haven't sold a lot of copies of it, but the book is really good and you can find the right agent for it, then they'll want to read it if you can pitch it well. If you can pitch it in a query letter well and you know, spark somebody's interest and curiosity in it, that's a big part of it. Yeah.
And where do you get agents' names? From the internet that you said, Agent Query, or?
Yeah, agentquery.com is a good place to look. There are a couple books in the store here that I think might be good sources as well. There's Writer's Market, which comes out every year. Jeff Herman's Guide, which is another big phone book-sized book that has agents' contact information in it. Those are two good ones. Yeah, so...
Stacey, what if you have published your book on your own? Can you just send it out to a publisher then?
You mean like actually take the book and just send it to them?
And,
I mean, you
know,
can.
well, I mean, after the query letter. And if they say, you know, would you like to read, you know, a copy that I've self-published on my own?
You can, but that's going to certainly raise a question. The agent's going to be like, well, what is this? You know, they probably look at it and say, well, this looks like a self-published book. So then they're going to want to know how many copies did it sell. And if you tell them, well, it sold, you know, 5,000 copies, then they're going to say, okay, I want to see this. If you say, well, it sold 100 copies, then they're not going to be as interested. So it's going to immediately raise a question for the agent. And
If it sold 5,000 copies, why would you want to give it to a major?
Because the agent could sell it to a publisher that could get it printed, you know, 250,000 times. Or 100,000 copies printed. But yeah, if you haven't sold it very well, if your book hasn't done very well, which most self-published books, quite honestly, don't, then you want to think about, well, how am I going to answer that question when they see that there's a self-published book here?
Well, The Shack was not was self-published.
Yes, excellent example.
And that did very, very well. Now, how did that guy do it?
He wrote.
Word of mouth?
It was word of mouth. I think The Shack was absolutely word of mouth, and I think he wrote.
From the church and everything that also led to that audience.
The novel was really, really good, for one thing. It's this, you know, heartfelt story with tons of compassion behind it, and he had a platform, and there was tremendous word of mouth for the book. And I don't know the specifics of who he's actually published with now, but I do know that I actually spoke with his publicist via email about a month or two ago because he was in the area, and I wanted to schedule him for an interview on the TV show. And I looked up his publisher, and it wasn't one of these major publishers based out of New York. And so I wonder if he has his own publisher still for it, or if it ended up selling to a major publisher. That's a very unique case, the Shack. But sure, yeah, if you
Confederacy of Dunces got published posthumously.
yeah.
Well, that's not exactly what you planned for.
Right.
I mean, and there's a story for all different kinds of ways. Honestly, though, if you're thinking about self-publishing, you really want to sell a lot of those books. You want to find a way to find an audience, or you want to think long-term of, okay, this is my first book, and maybe I'll only sell 50 or 100 or 250 copies, but the next book's going to sell 1,000. Or the next book's going to sell a couple thousand. The number that you really want to keep in mind is around 5,000 copies. If you can sell 5,000 copies completely on your own, which is a big number for a lot of us, but if you can sell that many on your own, that's really going to grab the attention of a lot of agents, because most first print runs for a novel are about 10,000 or 15,000 copies. And so to break even, a publisher needs to sell at least half of the print run. And so if they know this lady sold 5,000 copies on her last book that she did completely on her own, we could do a print run of 10,000, and we know she's going to sell, very likely going to sell 5,000 at least on her own. Then you're a viable, person. You're somebody worth perhaps risking and taking the time to invest in.
I just have an idea. Once I get, when the writer or the agent asks me, have I sold 5,000 copies? I say yes. Who's to say who bought the copies?
Yeah, that's assuming that these agents are dumb, though.
Well, I think there was a guy. Wasn't there a guy who did that?
Sure.
He spent $25,000 and bought.
Well, how many folks know Adam Shepard here? You know Adam Shepard's story. He's done very well, but he spent $30,000 on his self-published book. I don't know how many of you know that side of the story, but he actually bought a huge print run of those books, which then really lit a fire under his butt to get out and actually sell those books. But that was part of the story. I mean, he spent that money up front. Most of us don't have that kind of disposable cash to throw out for a book. But a lot of times it does take spending a lot of money to make money. There are a few examples of people whose books just really caught on by word of mouth and have done very well. In my own case, I'm seeing a huge surge with this book in a number of different venues of how I'm selling it, and I'm looking at the numbers coming in on how many books have sold, and actually have the data that I can draw on and circle, that's being printed up. So, but it took a lot. It took like 4 books to get to this point. The first 3 or 4 books I just didn't know. I didn't know exactly how to find the right audience and how to sell the books. And
is this book selling more in the West, where basically cougars, so they might have these kinds of attacks?
That kind of information I don't know. I don't know the demographics of where it's actually sold.
Okay.
Question.
Stacey, did you get your agent through your query letter?
I did. It's an interesting story. It's an exciting story. Irene read this query letter, sent me a response right around the same time that I had been talking with another agent who had responded about a week or 2 earlier, and was really excited actually about another novel. And he actually called my house, which is really unusual for an agent to do. He had read the query letter for this novel and asked for like the first 50 pages. I sent him the first 50 pages, and he said he missed his subway stop. He lives in New York, and he was reading the manuscript, and he said, I want to know the story behind this, and I want to know who you are. And we talked for about an hour or 2. And so that was right out there when I first started, when Irene responded, I should say. I had that agent who was really excited about it. And so guess what I did? I told Irene that, which she actually used the phrase, that gets my competitive juices up. And so once she knew there was interest, in it, then I was able to go back to Mike and say, I just want to let you know, because it's been a week or two and I haven't heard back from you. I've got another agent who is very interested in this book. That got him really interested. And there was one other agent in this mix as well. And so I ended up kind of creating this energy between the three of them. And when it came down to it, it was actually it was a little bit of a difficult decision which agent I wanted to sign with, because Mike had been very, he loved the book, and you don't know who's actually going to be the person that sells the book. One agent might take it and not have the contacts to be able to sell the book. And I ended up signing with Irene after a phone call and really some heartfelt deliberation, talking to my wife about it, and just thinking, well, who's most likely going to sell this, and who can I build a career with? And that's hard to tell from just a couple of phone conversations. One thing that Lee Child said in this interview that I did with him on Tuesday is think long term with an agent and build. It's like a relationship. You really want to try to build the relationship. So one thing I'm doing with this agent is I'm letting her know, how these other books are doing, for one thing. And I'm actually going to visit her this summer. She lives in New Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so I learned from my past experience. I signed with an agent a few years ago that didn't go anywhere. And I didn't ever actually meet her. And it was all done by phone. And so for this agent, I want to sit down and have lunch with her. Her mother's actually going to be in town, and she's going to show us around Santa Fe. And so I really will get a sense of whether this is somebody that I can see, building my family with and building my career with for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And that, I think, is something to consider, is really thinking long term and trying to meet these people ultimately and treat it like it's a business. Yes?
You'll be great in Santa Fe. You'll bond. I know you'll bond well.
I love the area.
Forgive me, but was this self-published?
It was. In fact, I had started moving forward with Claus before I even queried this round of agents. That said, this book is doing well enough right now. If the sales continue, I guarantee you she's going to want to talk about, well, do we want to push this to a major publisher?
So who is Kitchen Table Books?
That's me.
That's what I thought.
In fact, there's a little bit of a story there. I am considering starting my own press. It's something that I've had on kind of the table for a number of years, and so you might just keep an eye out for that and see if I'm soliciting manuscripts at some point in the near future. Other questions?
Do you really live on Cougar Terrace?
No. Wouldn't that be awesome? Cougar Terrace. I saw a mountain lion on the way over here today. I do want to remind folks that we are going over to TK Trips afterwards if you want to join us for a bite to eat or a little bit more informal discussion. And that the 4 copies deal, if you do buy 4 copies of Claus today, I'll be doing a signing right up here in a minute. If you buy 4 copies, I'd be happy to interview you about your book or anything you'd like to talk about. If you've got some sort of campaign or group you want to talk about, I could do that on my TV show. Copies of Claus are available for $13.99. Please support your independent bookstore by buying at least 1 copy tonight. $13.99 for a copy of Claus. I'm going to hang around up here. I do have this jar. If you don't have $14 and you just want to throw 50 cents or $50 in there, you can do that as well. Thank you all very much for coming tonight.